This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited today to get to speak with Elissa Sampson, who is an urban geographer, research associate, and lecturer in the Jewish Studies program at Cornell University. She received her PhD in urban geography at UNC Chapel Hill, and she studies how the past is actively used in diasporas to create new spaces of migration, memory, heritage, and activism. Her lifelong interest in migration, re-diasporization, and immigrant culture has been pursued in the Lower East Side, Brooklyn, Jerusalem, Paris, Ithaca, and elsewhere. Elissa, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. I am delighted.
Delighted to have you here. When we were corresponding about the conversation that we'd be having for Writing It, you wrote me that after receiving your PhD, quote, the initial call that I heard was to focus on what I cared about most, to teach and do research. The historical writing came from that impetus rather than vice versa. That was interesting to me, and I bet we actually have many listeners that also came to their academic work not necessarily through an interest in writing first. Can you tell us about what you were doing before academia and how and why you made the switch?
Before I graduated from a university with a degree in history, I had already lived in what was politely referred to as a slum neighborhood in a different city, where I worked as an organizer of children's groups and ran a program with over 20 groups. I mentioned this since teaching was always critical to how I understood myself as a scholarship student and afterwards. Upon graduation, I then taught in a Brooklyn high school where I was yanked out of the classroom since a disaster befell upon them. Their school secretary retired mid-semester, and I was yanked out of the classroom to handle transcript requests for graduates, the most famous of whom was Barbara Streisand. And it was a big game in Brooklyn, by the way, to write to her high school asking for her transcript, whether or not one was related to her. At that point, I looked at the New York Times help wanted ads and landed a job as a proofreader at a top accounting firm. Turned out that the typing pool used the latest IT equipment. So to use a computer in the dawn of an era, you needed to have two things: access to machines that someone could give you late at night precisely because you weren't a snob, and the ability to do what was called RTFM, a phrase which I will spare the possibly delicate ears of your listeners. So one day I did my own marked up blue pencil corrections, put the printout into the same box that the better paid typing pool placed their work in, and voila, I launched into a very diverse IT career that included teaching for major corporations. So yes, it's being in the right place at the right time, but also in the right era. Contingencies built into life and to history, but I was lucky and not everyone is. Life chances can be stacked against most children and young adults, and we see how that being able to earn a good living makes a deep difference. So I wanted to teach, and I was able to do so in the business world, and that having those licenses to teach in middle school and high school was more critical to launching myself into an IT career as a teacher. I made the switch into academia when I was 55 and realized what many realize today, which is that pursuing one's passion is both a luxury and a necessity. I wanted to learn about why my neighborhood, the Lower East Side, was gentrifying so rapidly. So I audited classes in urban geography in a top 5 department, realized it was the right fit, took the GREs since they didn't have a category called mature returning student, and I was admitted. I then need to figure out what all grad students need to do: how to constantly read, present, and write, and in my case, do archival research, and do it all in 5 years. Writing was the biggest hurdle.
So, does that mean that you hadn't really been writing much before you returned to grad school or started grad school?
I hadn't written at all.
Mhm.
I taught, I presented, I gave out handouts about how to use equipment or learn a programming language, but I didn't have to write other than emails or take notes at meetings.
Were you scared about that? That's starting to, have to do, I guess, long papers possibly in grad school.
Yes, though there's a way that grad school does prepare one for writing in as much as you have weekly assignments. So when you get weekly readings and you have to respond to those assignments, and a typical seminar would have 300 pages of readings a week, and so the responses were longish, is a good exercise. Having said that, actually writing a dissertation is a different type of job. And that took a lot of work in terms of my mastering the skills that were necessary to pull together chapters and understand how to tell a story out of my archival research. And that was useful. It was also painful, but it got done because I'm a great believer in deadlines.
So I'm curious if you felt that your work before helped you in any way to figure out how to write or break down this big project of writing a dissertation.
I'm logistically oriented, and people tell me that I over prepare, something that probably is related to my prior IT work in a field called disaster backup and recovery and business continuity. Yes. Having said that, I'm not a digital nomad, which would arguably be a more useful skill today since I'm also interested in learning about how technology affects us daily. As to how my prior training affects writing, my aspirational goal is that everything is planned and scheduled backwards from when it needs to get done. But one frankly learns to be humble on such understandings since I err on the side of being overcommitted. And I also know that when I write slowly, which is the way I write, it can be frustrating, but it's necessary for me since I need to think through what I write to understand if it conveys what it needs to, if it is worded serendipitously so that the reader can understand it, or more basically, does this argument make sense? It's only in putting words to paper and then checking and redrafting them that I can do that.
After you did your dissertation research, you mentioned that you needed to figure out how to make a story out of it, I guess how to make it kind of more readable for the reader. How did you figure out how to do that narrative? Did a advisor help you find dramatic points or think about an arc of a story? How did you take apart that project of telling a story from your research?
It was very hard, in part because everyone in my program was much younger than I was and much more accustomed to doing that. And their advisors had an easier time in terms of directing them into the type of narrative structure that would work in a field like geography. So I actually agreed to go to a class in which a few other students at my university were at least closer in age to myself and professionally geared and had somewhat of the same problem. They had had successful careers and had not been taught how to write. And so, in effect, we had a workshop group and we had an excellent instructor who made us go through the painful weekly work of learning how to write. You did it together and you did it with people you had nothing in common with.
I know many academics wish they actually had taken such a class. We often say we're usually not taught how to write as academics. But can you just tell us, like, what did the teacher break down or what kind of exercises did you do?
Well, the first thing she made us do was read a book called One Duck at a Time, which I would recommend for somebody who really is starting from scratch. And I certainly was. And the other people in that class, again, they went to a professional school, my university. So and they were trying for a doctorate, typically in the medical sciences. So they had really, again, no experience in trying to understand how daily work and would be structured and what a reader might need. Daily work is you just commit to doing whether it's 5 or 8 hours a day. You don't avoid it in any sense. You put it on a schedule. You don't do something called fritters, which I had never heard of, in which you decide to walk your dog or vacuum your rug, which is something that would never have occurred to me, frankly, to avoid writing because you were going to be back in class next week and reading something out loud and you're reading somebody else's draft. So it was entirely practical from that point of view. And then you got into the question of narrative and how to structure a dissertation. What would be expected by another academic, not simply one's advisor, but somebody outside of your field. In this case, it was a sociologist who enjoyed writing. And that's why she gave the class.
So it sounds like it was socializing students to academic writing, getting used to expectations, and just getting you into the habit of it too.
Yes, but also, how does narrative work? I mean that's a very broad question, obviously. What I mean, every dissertation needs, and every book needs an introduction, right? Some also need an epilogue, right, or ending chapter. But after that, I mean, you have to think about what are you pulling together? How are they connected? How do they does each stand alone? Because the standard academic advice is that each chapter should go into an article. And in fact, that is often possible. But when you're looking at something as a whole, which is whether it's a volume or monograph or a dissertation, it has to feel like something you want to fully read and that you're when you're going from chapter to chapter, it makes sense. It's not just a question of signposting. It's a question of understanding a narrative thread and captivating a reader. And she made that very clear.
Hmm. And I mean, I guess that class also probably made you feel like you weren't alone in, maybe struggling to figure out how to do this.
Yes, but I have to tell you, I learned far more about the health sciences than I would have otherwise.
I'm curious, having chosen academia at a different stage of life, do you think there were advantages or pros and cons to being at that stage as opposed to, I know many of us have classmates who were in their 20s or even straight from college?
Yes, I think that the cons are pretty obvious. There's no career path. The pros are also obvious. You get to follow your passion, even as you offer yourself this exact same caveat that one gives grad students. This has to be something you really want to do for its own sake, given the job market. I also think there's an advantage of being an older academic in that you're attuned to broader world events and to connecting that perspective to world history and understanding our own times. I can give you an example. There's an interest now in what's called replacement theory and talking about this question of whiteness in America, right? I've been teaching for years Madison Grant's work from 1916, which was quite popular, and it was called The Passing of the Great Race. And it was used actually by the Nazi Party as well. Now, when you do that sort of work, you see the ways that history gets channeled, goes underground, and emerges as ready to use with new twists. It's ready made for you. And that's part of why social media can jump on it. So you can connect things in your research, writing, and teaching that may not be as visible to younger faculty.
So is that a feeling of I've seen this movie before, or I've lived enough life where I've seen these things come and go?
No, I recognize this
Hmm.
and I recognize how it's being appropriated and I recognize its origins, even though the origins are not visible to the majority of people who use this particular trope.
I wanted to ask you, Alyssa, about your edited volume, which is titled From Popular Front to Cold War, the Interracial Left and the International Workers' Order from 1930 to 1954. How did this come about, and how was it that you had a co editor in working on this book?
I was inspired by the depth of the materials that were found at the Kiel Center, which is one of the world's premier labor history archives, and by a call for a proposal to digitize materials that had been extended 3 times, a sign that the library was looking for better proposals. I
Mm.
was awarded the grant because the materials that I was looking at had to do with a leftist Yiddish speaking garment workers organization, a fraternal order with lodges, ostensibly one of the most fuddy-duddy types of organization, but it shows that they had uniquely and deliberately chosen their doors to open their doors to others. So I knew that the topic was controversial, but thought that the historiography of immigrant and African American life in that time period had missed this moment since the founders of the International Workers' Order were pro Soviet and had been affected by the Bolshevik Revolution. And in fact, they're early precursors to the civil rights movement, among other things. But I also thought that their erstwhile importance had been deliberately overlooked, given that they had been shut down in a dubious way during the Cold War. And I thought that enough time had passed that this history should be open to view. So I digitized over 1,700 documents, primarily from a confiscated archive. Now, how did the book get published out of that? I then sent out invites to convene a May 2020 workshop with colleagues who were genuinely interested in this material. By March 2020, I was asking them to participate in an online conference called Die Linke, the Yiddish Left, which attracted 600 attendees in December 2020. I then worked with the other conference organizers and panelists after seeing that response. We were blown away. We decided it was worth doing a book, but much changed during the timing and the ongoing pandemic, including the contributors. So two of us took on the job of being co-editors. It's not a conference volume. It's a book of tightly edited historic case studies. One of the hardest editing tasks was to make sure that the chapters were in dialogue since the authors were not working together. And I would just add to that, its current resonance is absolutely on point, given that it's a series of critical case studies on immigrants, cultural work, Black nationalism, transnational movements from below and above, Jewish studies, and whiteness studies. At least it offers a window into modernity and communist thought. Where else can you find a book on an organization whose leaders and activists included Clara Lemlich, strike of 1909, Paul Robeson, the singer, Langston Hughes, the poet and writer, Vito Marcantonio, the congressperson, 7-term congressperson at that, and Louise Thompson Patterson, who founded Sojourners for Truth and Justice. So this fraternal organization punched above its weight and had almost 200,000 members in its heyday before the Cold War killed it. I would also add to that something simple that I didn't give people elevator speeches about this book. I think that can be overdone.
What do you mean by that?
I think younger academics, get prepped because of the pressure of the tenure clock and getting a book out to have elevator speeches, whether it's at the 30-second one or the 1-minute one recognizes them immediately. And so I did not take that approach. I took the approach of doing the work first, the archival work, the digitization, organizing a conference. And then the book came out of that organically. That's why Cornell University Press was interested in it.
Yeah, it's actually a great looking book too. I love the cover. You mentioned that desire to have the chapters, kind of in conversation, which can be challenging when, as you noted, the authors, it's not like they're working on them together. How did you accomplish that?
I think that, as you were hinting, you need to give feedback, encouragement, and be transparent about such a project in order to have people do a really good job with their chapters. So, feedback, including corrections, was welcomed along the way. Editing for brevity was necessary, given that the press had specified a word limit for each chapter, and then later sent a style guide, which meant that we needed to pay attention to endnotes, translations, and transliterations, and yet another round which had to meet a deadline. We were able to usefully point to resources from the archive or elsewhere that would strengthen their contributions. So I would say that transparency and encouragement are indeed key in offering explanations for one's own editorial interventions or in those asked for by the press's copy editor. And in some cases, we push back on those copy edits.
It sounds like you were actually kind of working kind of closely with the contributors. That's something many of us academics would like to happen when we're contributing chapters. Were you letting contributors know, oh, another author is talking about this subject, which you might want to bring in because it's actually relevant to what you're writing and would connect them?
Absolutely. So take the case of the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War is a pivotal event in the 20th century, and it affects almost everything in terms of looking at the left, whether it's the Spanish speaking left, the Italian speaking left, the Yiddish speaking left. And it is one of those moments that cannot be overestimated in terms of its importance. So the chapter on Paul Robeson has to include the fact that he and his spouse went to Spain. The chapter on Louise Thompson Patterson also has to include that. And their various views on Spain, as well as the chapter on that is really about the Spanish Civil War, or the chapter that's on Latin America and how people um, in many cases in Argentina and elsewhere, volunteered to go into the international brigades. So you have to be pointing out these connections constantly, but gently, in order to have that type of dialogue in which something reads as a book.
And you found that your contributors were receptive to this kind of feedback?
Absolutely. I cannot speak for them, though I am also a contributor. But the emails, that came at midnight, right, tell me that they were passionate
Mm,
about both what they had written and about whether something should be edited by whether it was by me, my co-editor, or the press.
mhm.
Interventions were welcome, particularly on grammar, spelling.
Yeah.
Interventions on the Spanish Civil War were definitely welcome. Interventions about style were less welcome in some cases, but it's it's sort of like a type of marriage.
Mhm.
No, we worked very intensively with each author.
Yeah, I find most of us academics are actually hungry to be edited and, that give someone giving that attention to your work is really appreciated. As many of our listeners know, it can be difficult to get a press interested in a volume of essays like this. And I'm curious how that worked for you. Did you guys shop different presses, or how did the marriage with Cornell University Press happen?
We put together a list of ideal presses that ended up as a list of three because we fall under the rubric also of labor history. And there are not that many presses that will publish in labor history. Having said that, Cornell made the most sense to us, given that the archives, which were mainly confiscated due to the Cold War, ended up at Cornell, and that I had a Cornell connection. Again, I'm not a believer in elevator speeches. I'm a believer in one does the work, one provides resources, and lets people know that they're available. And so when I spoke to the head of the press that the conference that we had convened in December 2020 had brought in 600 attendees on Zoom to learn about the archives, he was pretty impressed and said, send a proposal. So I sent the prospectus.
And I'm just curious, that meeting or this conversation you had with the editor, head of the press, how did that even come about? You were at Cornell at the time and got to meet him somehow?
I think it was a social occasion.
Okay. And I guess that's an example of, as you were saying, the numbers being able to say that there is this interest for the conference ends up being pretty good proof to someone like an editor that there might be readers for this kind of book.
I would also add to that, he was an excellent editor. So when we sent the prospectus, we had to go through a lot of work in which questions were posed and we had to answer within a very short deadline. in 4 pages exactly, those questions. And they were sharp, good questions. A real pleasure in some sense. And we had to wait for the outside reviews because the press was obviously not willing to take on such a book without outside reviews. And we could not propose the reviewers for obvious reasons. So we had to wait patiently for those outside reviews, and they were stunning. And when the outside reviews came back, we received feedback from both, and that feedback was helpful. We incorporated that in. And then when we did the first draft of the book and of the chapters, we got feedback from the editor of the press who personally took on the book.
Wow. Huh, why do you think that was?
He was interested.
Hmm. And I don't know if maybe the connection of the archives being at Cornell was a help there, do you think?
Absolutely, because almost nobody at Cornell knows that the Kiel Center has these confiscated archives. There are also donor archives on the International Workers' Order and the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, which was the Jewish section. And I've helped obtain some of those donations. Having said that, they're basically archives that really were underutilized. And I will also explain this by not simply noting that these are Cold War archives and something confiscated might be seen as something difficult, controversial, and unwelcome, but because they're in 16 languages and English is the lingua franca for the International Workers' Order.
Mhm.
So it's not everybody who would choose to work on them. But yes, we were very lucky that the head of the press decided to personally become our editor and give us feedback. He would ask us questions. What do you mean by a general lodge? How was it founded? Right? And we would explain that a general lodge meant that anybody could be in that lodge, and it would be typically interracial, whereas a lodge that was Italian would logically be an Italian lodge, same with the Yiddish speaking lodges.
Now that you've done an edited volume, I wonder if you're someone who is eager or excited to do about another one, or what's your feeling about editing these volumes now?
I think, as many know, an edited volume is actually much more work than a monograph.
Mhm.
And it is something that one should not undertake other than as a labor of love. And I say this feeling that I have met the best colleagues and have made friends for life in doing this work. Nonetheless, I believe my future writing will not be an edited volume, having undertaken this one.
What other kinds of writing projects are you thinking about or working on now?
The first is somewhat indirectly an outgrowth of this earlier project, and it has to do with an intersection of Jewish and Black history and a famous writer who was involved in the International Workers' Order, but it is about his work in a very different context in a much earlier period, since he was long lived. And the second is not related at all to the International Workers' Order. And if I end up doing it, I will do it by sending a prospectus to a different press that specializes more in that topic, which is more in my field of urban geography.
Since there was something kind of social about the edited volume that you worked on, I'm curious if that is a way that you want to continue writing, whether it's sharing your work with others or finding people who are working on related projects. Are you inclined to try to find that kind of sociality for writing for these future projects?
Yes. First of all, I mean, it's anodyne to say that you always need a second pair of eyes, right? But it's absolutely the case. And you become dependent in a good sense on honest feedback. So, yes, writing should not be a lonesome task in that sense. It is something that is collaborative and one has to give credit to others for. One is not simply self-made.
Very true. There's two questions we ask all guests, and one is, what is something that you wish you could tell your earlier or younger self about writing or publishing?
Simply said, I would have loved, in retrospect, mind you, retrospect, in graduating with a bachelor's degree in history, that I had focused on learning to write then. The universities I attended and I had transferred from one to another didn't offer the equivalent of that freshman writing course to me. So if I had theoretically learned to write when I was younger, I suspect it would have been much easier to pick up that pen and put it to paper when I was older.
Another question we ask all guests is if there is a writing habit or practice that is working for you.
I think it's standard advice, which is write daily, especially when drafting, and that writing includes responding to one's emails.
Hmm. When you're writing emails, do you actually feel yourself kind of thinking about style or creativity or things like that?
Yes, if you make email into a way of thinking, and I understand that email sometimes simply requires a yes, no, or a date or time. And one should not
Right.
presume that everybody wants to,
Mhm.
read a lengthy response. But when it becomes an opportunity to think when responding, I believe it actually is one of the best ways of learning how to write and to think through problems, historic and others, and to learn other people's stories because you can
Mm,
elicit stories sometimes by way of email.
that is a great idea. Thank you, Alyssa. It's been really fun to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I hope that the writers that hear this podcast feel encouraged that one can do it without having had the proper training, but having the proper motivation.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.